Well, we started a new sermon series last week that we entitled Four Portraits, One Jesus. Last week we looked at the Gospel of Mark, how Mark portrays Jesus as the suffering servant. This week we want to look at the Gospel of Matthew. Now, out of all of the other Gospels, Matthew, he's very structured with his Gospel. Matthew was a tax collector, and if you know anything about tax collectors at that time, they were hated. They were considered traitors to their own people. They collected taxes from the Jews, being Jews themselves, and give them to Rome. They were hated. They were despised, but they were really good at taking notes and bookkeeping. So his gospel is structured, and the main point that Matthew wants to point out is that Jesus is the Messiah. That's how he wants to portray Jesus, that Jesus is the Messiah that the Jews have been waiting on for so long. I mean, the end of Malachi, the last book of our Old Testament, it ends with this anticipation of the coming Messiah. And in those 400 years, from Malachi to Matthew, what some call that intertestamental period, where God is silent, there was many who stood up and said that they were the Messiah, that they were going to deliver the Jewish people from the Roman oppression, but then they were killed. They were destroyed. And then here comes Jesus, humbly born in a manger. Not really the type of person that you would look at and say, he's going to grow up to be a king. He's going to grow up and be the mighty Messiah that we are waiting for. He wasn't really what they expected. Maybe he wasn't even really what they wanted. And we kind of get a glimpse of what Matthew has set out for him. To go about trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah was no small task for Matthew to accomplish. The past 10 years or so, Stan Helkin was a Jew. He was his Jewish family, but he wrote a book called Betrayed, where his daughter goes off to college, and while she's at college, she becomes a Christian. And as the book would be entitled, he felt that his daughter has betrayed not only him, but has betrayed their God and the whole family line. She has betrayed everything about who she is. So he goes about to study Christianity, to try to disprove Christianity and bring her back to the Jewish faith. And unbeknownst to him, his wife is doing the same thing. But through their studies, he becomes a Christian. His wife becomes a Christian, but neither of them knows that the other is Christian. They just don't want to admit it to each other. And finally, they confess. You see, for many of the Jews, saying that Jesus is the Messiah is betraying everything they're about. Even though they've been waiting for this Messiah. So Matthew had no small task. And the first thing that Matthew looks at is Jesus' birth. Through Jesus' birth, he begins to set the stage for Jesus as the Messiah. The very first verse in Matthew 1, starting with verse 1, it says this: "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Now, to us, that's a verse that oftentimes we just skim over very quickly because we know what comes next. The genealogy, so-and-so is the son of so-and-so, and so-and-so is the son of so-and-so. If you can't sleep, that's one thing we're going to stay up and read. That's why we skim. We don't see a significance to it. But in that very first verse, Matthew is saying quite a bit. It's in Jesus Christ, the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, for some of us, we say, well, that may make sense. That's his first name, that's his last name, Jesus Christ, but it's not his last name. You see, Christ, in Greek, Christos, is equivalent to the Hebrew word for Messiah. What Matthew is saying is, Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah that you have been waiting on, here's his genealogy. And to prove it, he is the son of Abraham, and he is the son of David. These are two huge figures within the Jewish faith. Abraham is the father of the nation, the one that God came to and said, leave your homeland to go to a land that I will show you, and I will make your descendants more numerous than the stars in the sky, and your descendant will be a blessing to all of the nations. You see, Jesus is a fulfillment of that. Paul noticed that. Paul says God does not say your descendants will be a blessing to all the nation, but your descendants. Jesus is that fulfillment because he is the blessing to everyone. He's the son of David. The covenant that God made with David is that one of your descendants will sit on the throne forever. And now, as I speak, Jesus is on his throne. He is in charge. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we've said before, although it may look like my world is just falling apart at times and there is no control, God is in control. Jesus is the King. But I find it interesting, if you read throughout the genealogy, there's 5 women that we find within it. And that's kind of unique for a Jewish genealogy. Most of the time they would leave out the women in it, but Matthew adds them here. They're also, in one sense, all outsiders. I think there's a purpose to that. You see, Jesus is not only the Messiah to the Jews, Jesus is the Messiah, the Redeemer to all mankind. You see, because in a sense, we were all outsiders. We've been grafted in through Christ. So Matthew begins with Jesus' birth, pointing to Jesus being the Messiah, but then he focuses on Jesus' fulfillments. You see, because 10 times throughout this gospel, Matthew will say stuff like, this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets. And then he'd go on. At least a dozen other times, if not more, he alludes to other prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Out of all of the other Gospels, Mark or Matthew focuses more on Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies than any other Gospel. He quotes the Old Testament 57 times. The only one that comes near that is Mark, which is 30. You see, he's writing to a Jewish community. And he's trying to show the Jews the passages that you've been reading and studying your entire life. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of that. You see, throughout history, God was setting down a blueprint, a fingerprint, you could say, of what the Messiah would look like, what the Anointed One, what the Redeemer of Israel would be, so that when he came, there'd be no question. This is the Messiah. You see, because within the book of, one of my favorite books by Lee Strobel is called Case for Christ. Lee Strobel, once again, he was an atheist. He was a criminal journalist for the Chicago Tribune. His wife became a Christian, so he felt like he got the little old bait and switch. He married one thing, she turned into something else. But he was fairly pleased that she was more loving, she was more kind, she was more fun to be around. So he wanted to discover this whole thing about Christianity, and throughout his discovery, he himself became Christian. You see, I think there is a theme there. Those who truly study Christianity, many of them discover who Christ is. But he would do some interviews with scholars, and one guy that he talked to, he was a Christian preacher, but he was, for most of his life, a Jew that became a Christian. So he goes to him and he asks him how he became a Christian, and he became a Christian by reading the Jewish scripture, which is our Old Testament. And within that, the more he studied, the more that he read, he found Christ throughout the pages. And he said this, and I find this so fascinating. He said that one man did the math, and for one person to fulfill just eight of the prophecies, he says that is 1 in 100 million billion. I mean, that is millions of times greater than the number of people who has ever walked the face of this earth. Put another way, let's make it a little bit more visual. He said if you would get a silver dollar and you would cover the state of Texas in silver dollars, it would come up to about 2 feet deep. And let's say you mark one of those silver dollars, you place it somewhere in the state of Texas, you blindfold a man, have him walk the state of Texas, bend down, pick up a silver dollar. What is the likelihood that he would pick up the one that's marked? That is the same likelihood that someone would fulfill just 8 of the Old Testament prophecies. Jesus fulfilled over 100, and that's a low number. Another man by the name of Peter Stoner, he did the calculations of what it would be for a man to fulfill 48 of the prophecies. And he said it is 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. That's equal to the number of atoms in a trillion, 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 billion universes. That's the size of our universe. Imagine the science geeks in the room. The atoms that's just in this room. We're just on this planet. Imagine the atoms that's within this universe. And the trillions and the trillions and trillions of universes with all of those atoms. That's the likelihood that one man could fulfill 48. Jesus fulfilled at least over 100. It's not a coincidence. So to do Matthew's gospel justice, the fact that he is trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, we cannot overlook these facts. But there is no way that any one man could fulfill all of the prophecies, that he could fulfill the blueprint, the fingerprint that God has made for his Messiah, other than God himself. There's no question who Jesus is. Jesus is the Messiah, and that's the whole point that Matthew wants to make. Even the structure of his book focuses at this fact. Because one of the prophecies was that in Deuteronomy chapter 18, God promises Moses that I will raise up a prophet like you. One that I will give my word to, and the people must listen to him. So God is going to raise up a prophet like Moses. In the Jewish mind, there is not very many people greater than Moses. Moses was the bringer of the law. If you were to break up Matthew's gospel, you could break it up into 5 discourses, 5 teachings. You got the Sermon on the Mount, you got the commissioning of the 12 disciples, the parable of the kingdoms, the church life and discipline, the woes to the religious leaders in what's called the Olivet Discourse. 5 discourses that he has, 5 teachings that's sandwiched in by narratives. And what Matthew's doing through this structure is he's presenting Jesus as a Moses-type bringer of a new covenant. He's presenting his gospel much like a Christian Pentateuch. Pentateuch means 5 scrolls, 5 books. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what we consider the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He's got 5 discourses. And we see this play out the greatest in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. When did the Jewish people get the law? Moses went up on a mount. He came down. And he gave the law to the people. Jesus' first public ministry, his first public sermons that we see in Matthew, he's going up on a mount to teach, to give his commands, to give his law. And he does something to show the fulfillment of God is going to raise somebody up just like Moses. But he's showing he's greater. Because he says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. You know, Moses said this to you, but I say this. He's not only saying, I'm fulfilling what was spoken, that God is going to raise up a prophet like Moses, but I'm telling you that I'm even greater than Moses. My word is greater than his. You see, Matthew is setting the stage. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Messiah for the Jewish people. He's the Messiah for everyone. And there is no doubt that Jesus is the Messiah, because nobody could fulfill all of those prophecies if it wasn't for God's hand at work. And he shows it by Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. I love the passage. Let's read it in Matthew chapter 21. Starting with verse 1. It says, now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied to a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and the others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosea to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. You see, Jesus' entrance into Galilee, or into Jerusalem, was a vivid picture of a king coming into his city. And they knew that. They knew what it stood for. That's why they laid the branches down. That's why they was worshiping him as he was coming through. They knew he was the king coming into Jerusalem. But the question is, how can they go from that to screaming, crucify him? In a week's time, they go from praising him, seeing him as the king coming into Jerusalem, the mighty Messiah that is going to redeem the Jewish people, and within a week they're screaming out, crucify. Why? What You see, what the Jews were wanting, what they were expecting, was the Messiah to come in to rally the Jewish people and to destroy the Roman oppression. That's what they wanted. They wanted a military and political leader that would come in and once again restore them to a world power. That's the Messiah that they had pictured throughout the reading of the Old Testament. That's what they were anticipating, and Jesus was not what they were expecting. And I would dare to say Jesus may not have been what they wanted. And I wonder if we struggle with the same. I mean, we can sit here and I can do my best to prove to you that Jesus is the Messiah, and you may believe that, but he may not be the Messiah that you want. You see, because oftentimes we do the same as the Jewish people. We focus on the physical and the temporary. We want a Messiah that will come and make this life a piece of cake. We want a Messiah to come so that I can have health and wealth and be happy. And that he will make everything great in this life. If that's the Messiah that you're waiting on, it's not the Messiah you're going to get. Because the Messiah that you're going to get is the Messiah that came into Jerusalem as a king and went to the cross to defeat our greatest enemy. You see, the Jews thought their greatest enemy was the Roman soldiers, the Roman Empire, when their greatest enemy was Satan himself. And Jesus' walk into Jerusalem, and later his walk to the cross, and his death on the cross, and later his resurrection was the greatest battle that we could ever imagine. And that's the Messiah that I want. You see, because he's not promised us that this life is going to be easy, that this life is going to be pleasant. He's not promised us any of that. Actually, he's promised us, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And he's told us, though, to take heart because he has overcome the world. He's told us that hardships is going to come. He told us that this life is not going to be easy. But he's also showed us that he is our Messiah. The one who has redeemed us. The one who has given us hope. That this life is not all there is. And he's given me hope knowing that as soon as I've accepted him, my eternal life has begun. It's not necessarily something that I'm waiting on. Once I die, eternal life begins. No, it's begun for me, and it's begun for you